Hi, fourth graders. So on chapter 16, we ended it with like a lot happening. Gerda found the door. She went back down and she realized that it was a tunnel to the west, to freedom, to where her dad is, where her brother is. So now I think we're gonna have a lot of interesting things happen in chapter 17. I dug a little deeper with my hands, but didn't get very far before I realized this wasn't a smart way to start a tunnel. At the least, I needed the shovel and more light than what came from this small flashlight. And I couldn't walk out of here with my entire body as filthy as my hands already were. That would get me noticed by every Stasi officer in Berlin, not to mention the border guards, informants, and probably the great majority of nosy neighbors within a square kilometer of this place. Before I dug any farther, I had to have a plan. I also had to ask myself exactly how serious I was about escaping. Now that I knew what Papa wanted, I better understood just how dangerous it was for me to be standing here. I didn't have to dig or tunnel or do anything but be inside this air raid shelter to give them enough reason to arrest me, or worse. And if I started, I would have to finish because a half dug tunnel was no different to the Stasi than a failed escape attempt. And my punishment would be no less severe. If I started, I was committing myself to literally do it or die, and my odds weren't exactly on the side of success. My legs were shaking when I climbed out, and I took extra time to make sure the wood boards across the window looked exactly as they did the first time I'd found them. I'd been angry when I left here before and might have been more careless with the boards than I should have been. My footprints showed clearly in the softer part of the dirt, and Frau Eberhardt had already seen me with a shovel. I haven't even I hadn't even started digging yet, and already my mistakes were mounting. I brushed over my tracks and then stuck to the hard soil instead, but I couldn't work up the nerve to dart across the empty field and into the alley. The best I could do was to sink along the edge of the wall and hope if anyone saw me that I looked casual enough to escape any farther attention. But it was nearly impossible to pretend that my senses weren't focused on every detail around me. If the watchtower guards had binoculars, they might look at my hands and wonder how they'd gotten so dirty. I wished I had pockets like boys did for their pants, but my skirt didn't have any, so I hid my muddy fingers within the folds of my skirt and hoped that wouldn't look as strange or obvious to anyone else as it did to me. Every person I passed on the way home seemed to be watching me closer than usual, and the expression on my face must have invited questions. But nobody said a word. Perhaps God still granted miracles to those behind the iron curtain. The first thing I did after getting home was to scrub my hands until long after the water had run clean, or maybe until they had stopped shaking. When I finished, I found a note from Mama on the counter. She hoped to be at Oma Gertrude's only until Sunday and thought that if we were careful, there should be plenty of food in the house to last Fritz and me until then. And she was very clear that we weren't to get into any trouble or break any rules. Considering where I'd just come from, her note had come too late for me. I paced the apartment for the rest of the afternoon, debating whether to tell Fritz about the tunnel. I knew I shouldn't. Tunneling under the death strip was probably impossible. And even if it wasn't, we'd still have to get through the tunnel without being shot like Anna's brother. Despite that, I couldn't stop thinking about the possibilities if I were to succeed. What would it take to build a tunnel? Lots of digging, obviously. Was I capable of all that on my own? Maybe with enough time, but there was so much I didn't know. How would I know if I was going straight or that I was deep enough? How would I know when it was safe to tunnel back up to the surface? That would be my luck, to tunnel straight up into the center of the death strip. Considering the limits of my own abilities, I knew I needed help. But Fritz was trying hard to be a model citizen, probably to get Claudia back. So I couldn't involve him, and there was no one else I trusted. If I was going to be smart about this, and it was about time I did something smart, then there was really only one option: let the tunnel be a good idea that wasn't meant to happen. By the time Fritz came home, I had decided for certain not to tell him, and I knew that was the right thing to do. Once I saw the slump of his shoulders and frown on his face, he looked worse than sad. It was like he'd simply accepted what the state was going to do to his life. He had given up. Maybe he had good reason to look the way he did, but it was worse because I was helpless to cheer him up, even if I could. There was nothing encouraging I dared say to him in our bug department. He mumbled a hello and said he was going to his room. I offered to make dinner, which really only meant I was going to warm up Mama's leftovers from last night. It wasn't much, but it was something. When dinner was ready, I called him to the table, but there was no answer. Even if he was seriously depressed, Fritz was never one to ignore a chance to eat. Thinking he must have fallen asleep, I went to his bedroom and opened the door to tell him to come. But he wasn't sleeping. Fritz was at his desk writing on a paper, and when his door opened, he turned it over in a blink. I didn't know hands could move that fast. My eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" "Nothing," which was an obvious lie. Then his eyes darted around the room as if the Stasi's secret bugs would be that easy to find. "Just a little extra homework, that's all." "Oh, right." My voice might have sounded like I agreed with him, but the expression on my face made it perfectly clear I knew something more was going on. "Food's ready." We shared the usual meaningless chatter over dinner. We talked about school, about how long Mama might be at Oma Gertrude's, and about our plans for the summer. I didn't care about any of it, and neither did he. Fritz did let one piece of actual news slip into the conversation, something I had suspected for a while, but never dared ask about it. He had been fired from the bricklaying job, and we both knew why. I've tried to find other work for this summer, but nothing's turned up yet. His voice was hopeful, but his eyes were dead. Does Mama know? Without Papa here, we counted on the money from Fritz's after school job to get us through each year. Mama doesn't need any more worries. I thought about the tunnel I could build. With his bricklaying skills, he could easily get a job in West Germany, and their money was worth 5 times the value of ours. After supper, Fritz returned to his room with strict instructions that I wasn't allowed to enter without knocking. He'd never done that before, confirming my suspicions that he had some big secrets. I would have snuck in and peeked at his papers if he left his room, but he never did. Not once. I didn't find out anything until breakfast the following morning. He came out of his room with the papers in his hand. He commented on how cold it was and that he wanted a fire. It was actually a perfect spring morning, one in which we'd never build a fire, not unless we needed to burn Fritz's papers, of course. I told him I would help with the fire, and after it was started, he let me see the papers. I had figured it must be some way of getting back together with Claudia, but it wasn't. What he had written was so much worse. Page 1 said, "There's no future here for me. I'm leaving East Berlin tonight." My eyes widened, and I drew in a sharp breath. He shook his head as a warning for me to keep quiet and then crumbled the page and threw it into the fire. Page 2. "I found a place near the spree that isn't well guarded. I can run for the water and swim across before I'm seen." I shook my head as violently as I dared. The Spree was a powerful river, and the Berlin Wall ran along much of its wide banks. Large, heavy boats navigated that river, and everyone knew the current was stronger than it looked on the surface. Even for an experienced swimmer, it was dangerous. For Fritz, it could mean death. Remembering the microphones, he commented that the fire should get us warm soon. I was stunned and angry to make any response. Then he raised his pages again. Page 3 said, "I wanted you to know so you can explain to Mama. It's not fair, but it's the best I can do." "No." I continued, shaking my head, and tears stung my eyes. He wasn't the first to try escaping through the spree, and so many people had died in that attempt. Either they drowned on the way or else were shot in the back by Grenzers as they swam. Even on the small chance that Fritz got as far as jumping into the water, he wasn't likely to get out again. Page 4 said, "I will not join their military. Eventually, I'll think like they do, and I will not let them ruin my life. You must understand, Gerda." His eyes pled with me to accept his decision, but I couldn't. Yes, I understood the desire to leave and his frustrations over feeling that there was no hope for him here. I felt just as boxed in as he did, maybe even more. There probably wasn't much hope for me either, and it would only get worse if he left me behind. I wanted to leave as much as he did, but not in this way. Page 5 said, "You can't stop me. My mind is made up. I am going to leave." He started to crumple up that page and toss it in the fire with the others. But this time I grabbed it and ran for a pencil. While making a lame comment to the microphones about breakfast, I smoothed the paper out again. On the back, I drew a map to the building I'd found near the wall, and then pulled out the picture Papa had sent to me. On his paper, I wrote, "Meet me here after school. Be careful." Fritz looked up at me, his eyes burning with curiosity. I wrote one more word, tunnel. Once I was sure he knew where to go, I crumpled up his paper and tossed it into the fire.